Hello and welcome to Archive West Texas on Classical 105.7. I'm your host, Gordon Wilkerson, joined as always by our producer, Rachel Boyd. On this program, we visit with the people who have shaped the history, culture, and business life of our region. We focus on their stories and accomplishments, but we also look for inspiration, lessons in leadership, service, perseverance, and community that can guide the next generation. Our guest today is former Lubbock Mayor Alan Henry. Alan's a longtime insurance professional and civic leader who has served this community in many capacities. Earlier in his career, he had the opportunity to work closely with one of the most influential political figures ever to represent West Texas, Congressman George Mahon. Congressman Mahon represented the 19th Congressional District for more than 4 decades and rose to become chairman of the powerful House Appropriations Committee. His leadership truly shaped national policy while bringing lasting investment and stability to West Texas. Alan, welcome to Archive West Texas.
Thank you, Gordon.
We were talking earlier about how today many people recognize the Mahon Federal Building or the George and Helen Mahon Library, but many people do not really know Congressman Mahon's true story or the full story. So thank you for taking time today to share your perspective with our listeners. Who was George Mahon?
Well, George Mahon, as you so rightly said, was the most influential person in the 20th century as far as Lubbock is concerned, in my opinion. In fact, there's always a debate about whether it would be Preston Smith, our governor, or George Mahon, our congressman. I tend to talk a little more about Congressman Mahon because I knew him well and worked with him.
Well, they were both giants in politics.
He was the only
Texas.
Congressman for 44 years that Lubbock ever had. He was the first congressman to be elected from the District 19 when it was formed in 1933 and served continuously until he retired in 1978.
I'm reading a little bit of background on him. He was actually born in Louisiana.
Yes.
And then his family moved, I take it, to the Colorado City area?
Yes, he was one of 6 children, born in Claiborne area of Louisiana, North Louisiana, and actually grew up in a town called Mahon. It was named for his grandfather. But the family fell on hard times as far as farming was concerned, and so his father moved everyone out to Lorain, Texas, because that was where the train went at that time. And Lorain was experiencing a lot of growth. And so he just uprooted all his children and took his wife and his mother and his sister. So there were 10 of them that got on a train and moved to Lorain, Texas. They didn't have a home when they got there, so they rented a 3-room cottage and had to stay there until they could sell their farm back in Louisiana to have enough money to buy property in Lorain. So you talk about taking a chance.
Right, I'm going to reveal my ignorance here. I'm not exactly sure where Lorain is.
Well, I'll tell you, Lorain is 8 miles from Colorado City, which we'll get into in a minute. So he went from the town of Lorain, which still is about 500 people, to Colorado City, which was the metropolis 8 miles away when he began his political career.
So how old was he when they moved to Lorain?
He was 8.
8?
He was 8. They moved to Lorain in 1908. He was born in September 22nd, 1900.
He was educated in Lorain?
He graduated from Lorain High School, then attended Simmons, which we now know as Hardin-Simmons, in Abilene, and graduated there, and then attended the University of Texas Law School and graduated there at magna cum laude.
So what do you think were some of the early influences on him that helped shape his character and perhaps ignited an interest in public service?
First of all, he came from a large family, and he said that everyone had their own job, and they all had to work together, and he recognized the need for cooperation and for everyone to advance together. And I think that just carried over into his desire for public office. He was actually had only been an attorney for a few years and was appointed by Governor Dan Moody as the district attorney out of Colorado
Mitchell
City.
County,
and so he served 2 terms as district attorney. So he'd already gotten the idea of public service in his mind. And then when the Texas legislature set up the 19th congressional district in 1933, he decided he wanted to run for that. And so he did. It was quite a story we can get into if you want to.
Well, let's talk about that.
Okay.
So this congressional district is not established until 1933.
That's correct.
And tell our listeners what's required to constitute a congressional district. It's a population growth. Finally got to be enough people out in West Texas.
Well, they just divided. There was one district called it was the 18th congressional district, and there were finally enough people in West Texas to divide the 18th and create the 19th. Yes, and it went from Haskell on the east side all the way over to the New Mexico border. And so when Mr. Mahon heard about that, he really decided he wanted to run.
But the primary population centers were not Colorado City.
No.
It would have been Lubbock, and at that time, the districts changed so much over the years.
Lubbock and Plainview.
Plainview.
Yes, Slayton. But Lubbock was much larger, and that's a very interesting story because Lubbock had a candidate for the congressional district. His name was Mulliken. He was a district judge here. And he was supported by the Lubbock Avalanche Journal, the largest newspaper. But Mr. Mahon was a campaigner. He would go to every small town, and he had a very strong, dynamic speaking voice. He was on the debate team at Simmons University. And so most of the time, he didn't even have a microphone. He was just in the back of a pickup. And people would come from miles around to hear him. So he was able to convince people. He at that time, he was in his early 30s. And so the judge, and there were actually a couple of others that were running, were holding it over his head that he was too young. And of course, he convinced them that being young was an advantage, not a disadvantage. And it turned out he was right by being able to serve as long as he did.
That's a remarkable story. You told our listeners about the establishment of the 19th Congressional District and how Congressman Mahon was an excellent campaigner, really up against an endorsed candidate in a larger population center that was even a little more mature than he was. Tell us, was an upset that he won this seat?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yes, he was definitely the underdog without question. But he had some good allies. He had a retired judge named Judge Ely who was backing him. And as a young guy, Mr. Mahon, he had friends too. They just worked hard. And one of the interesting things was the Avalanche Journal, Charlie Guy, was endorsing the judge, the older judge, the more experienced judge. And he said, "This is our first congressman. It's very important that we not send a boy to do a man's job." And he said, "Let's send a man to do a man's job." So the judge, in order to try to win votes, said, I want to get down on the level of the common man so that I'll understand the issues. And Mr. Mahon said, "I'm already on the level of the common man, and I don't have to step down. I'm already one of you." And that really stuck.
Well, and this is a time when this is the middle of the Great Depression.
Yes.
In an agriculture-centered economy in West Texas.
It was.
And a period of time where an endorsement of a paper like the Avalanche Journal carries a whole lot of weight because that's the only form of communication most people have.
Right. That's right. And of course, Mr. Mahon was endorsed by some of the smaller papers And there was a lot of rivalry between the different editors, and so he did have some very strong endorsements, but as you point out, it was not from the population centers.
So he wins this election. He's how old when he's elected to Congress?
33.
33. So goes to Washington. What's Washington like in 1933, and what does Congressman Mahon find when he gets there?
Well, of course, Washington was in the middle of trying to come out of the Depression. And so all of the efforts were trying to stabilize the economy and help the people that were needing assistance because of the Depression. Mr. Mahon mentioned later on that when that first session of Congress, the letters he got, more than 50% were just people asking for a job. And that was the situation at that time.
That's hard to even wrap your head around if you're born later. When people were born in the 30s, there's a certain mentality that lives with them forever.
You're exactly right.
And to try to govern at that time and try to solve those problems, that's a big ask. Congressman Mahon was a Democrat. What did it mean to be a Democrat in Texas in the 30s and 40s?
Well, and in those first years, Texas essentially was a one-party state. In order to be elected, you were elected as a Democrat, and then you chose your lane as a Democrat. And Mr. Mahon was always in the very conservative lane. He would fit very nicely into the Republican Party of today. But for example, when I was up in Washington working for Mr. Mahon, Lyndon Johnson was working on getting the Great Society passed. And Mr. Mahon voted against quite a bit of the Great Society for his friend Lyndon Johnson.
Because of his fiscal conservatism.
Because of his fiscal conservatism and his social conservatism, I might add. That was just the way the situation was back then. And he adapted in his own unique way.
Talk about the Texas influence on national politics at that point in time. You had Sam Rayburn, who was Speaker of the House for over 20 years. You had Lyndon Johnson, who before he was president, pretty much ran the Senate.
Yes.
And then you had Congressman Mahon, who was a key member of the Appropriations Committee, ultimately became its chair.
It was a wonderful time to be working in Washington. There were, I believe, 6 of the standing committees were chaired by Texans. You had Lyndon Johnson as the president. You had George Mahon, who was not only chairman of the Appropriations Committee, he continued to be chair of the Armed Services Committee. I remember Ralph Yarborough, one of the senators at that time, said George Mahon is the 3rd most powerful man in Washington, behind only the president and vice president. Now, whether that's not the way the Constitution is set up, but as far as power is concerned, to have that office and the backing of the president certainly put Lubbock on the map.
How did he become involved with appropriations and armed services?
Well, when he first went to Washington, he was appointed to a couple of nondescript committees. I can't even remember the names of them. They're in Janet Nagelbauer's book here we can talk about. But he served there for a few years, and then an opening came on the Appropriations Committee. And at that time, the delegations from the states voted for where they would be supporting, whom they would be supporting for that spot. And he was able to get the Texas delegation to vote for him to go on the Appropriations Committee. So he served on the Armed Services Appropriations Committee or Military Appropriations Committee for a number of years and chaired it. And then when Mr. Cannon, who preceded Mr. Mahon, he passed away in the early 60s. And actually, Mr. Mahon then was selected as chairman of the Full Appropriations Committee in 1964, which was just shortly before I went up in 1966.
That position, he's in charge of the budget of the federal appropriations.
Well, yes.
I mean,
yes,
that's a big job.
It is, no question about it. And it's always said that the Congress can pass all the laws it wants to, but if it doesn't have the money to make it happen, it's not going to happen. So the appropriations process was and continues to be vital as far as the Congress is concerned.
Al, you've got a couple of books with you, one by...
We have two. One which is the most recent. It actually came out in 2017, and it is a very meticulously researched book on Congressman Mahon. A very long, some people would say tedious, but I like to say just detailed book because she does do a wonderful job on following Mr. Mahon throughout his congressional career. It's called A Witness to History. The other one is a smaller book that was written by Wanda Webb Evans, and it was actually published in 1981. I knew Wanda and was privileged to be interviewed for that particular book, and she does a very nice job also, a little more on the personal side and not so much about the historic aspect. But both of those, one is called One Honest Man by Wanda Evans, and the other Witness to History by Janet Nagelbauer. So I would suggest people who are interested might try one or both of those.
Thanks for providing that reference. Congressman Mahon was one of few legislators who I would say had a front row seat to the Manhattan Project.
Yes. That came about primarily because of his position as chair of the Military Appropriations Committee. So he and the other members of the committee studied very studiously the requests of the military for appropriations, and this, of course, was beginning World War II and during World War II. And they noticed that there was an inordinate amount of money being requested for general purposes. And Mr. Mahon was not somebody who appropriated for general purposes. And so he pretty much insisted that the Pentagon give them some information. Well, the Pentagon would give them only as much information as it would take to make them happy for that time. But as it progressed and the Manhattan Project, which everyone knows is the development of the atomic bomb, was moving along, it became necessary to have a member of Congress actually more involved. And so Mr. Mahon was one of about 5 people that were in the loop as far as the development of the atomic bomb. He flew down to Alabama, Huntsville, and was given the tour about just what is the splitting of an atom and what will happen. But he was not able to even tell Mrs. Mahon where he was going, or much less what he was doing. So it was a very, very interesting time in our history. And Mr. Mahon said that the day that they told him what they expected to happen when they dropped one of these bombs, they said they would drop it and it would actually detonate several hundred feet above the ground. And so everything within a 2-mile radius would be immediately incinerated. And he said, I couldn't sleep that night. I can imagine with having that burden of knowledge on your shoulders. He was deeply involved throughout as far as Congress was concerned, and he was credible enough that he could tell other members of Congress that this is really important, and they would believe him. And it was not necessary or advisable to have a lot of other people involved. We all know that. So that was a responsibility that he had that most people just don't know about.
And I think it represented a different age in politics. It was possible. I honestly don't know if there's a single person in Congress today, and I'm not pointing fingers, not that carried that same sort of gravitas. Wanda Evans refers to as one honest man. There were leaders at that time whose character stood for so much that when they said this is a good idea and this needs to be done, it got done without any questions being asked. Right. And we seem to have lost that.
Sure. Everyone at that point realized you needed leadership. And Mr. Mahon was just a natural leader. He was tall. He had a commanding presence about him, but he was not overbearing. He was friendly. And so he just ingratiated himself just by being himself. And so he was just a very credible person to have the knowledge that he did.
He worked with a number of different presidents. Was it to be Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson,
let's see,
Nixon, Ford,
let's
Carter?
See, right, yeah.
Did he ever share any impressions on the presidents that he worked with?
Well, yes, he did. He and Eisenhower hit it off. And he made some trips with Eisenhower when he was president. He actually got along well with all of them. When I was working for him, Gerald Ford was actually one of his subcommittee chairs, Jerry. And he and Jerry Ford played golf together. Mr. Mahon developed a very good golf game. And so, interestingly enough, he played golf with Gerald Ford, with Richard Nixon, a Republican, and Dwight Eisenhower quite often. So he went to Burning Tree Country Club, and that was the place that he really could unwind and was a pretty good golfer.
I did not know that.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about his family.
Okay, well, he married Helen, and they had actually met in Simmons. In high school. Yeah. She was Helen Stevenson, and they dated in high school. Did get married, and Mrs. Mahon was as much a part of the office as anyone. She was there every day, unpaid. But she would, he looked to Mrs. Mahon for advice and counsel. She would take people on tours of the Capitol. She was very good at that. And so they just made a wonderful team. Never forget the first time I was working with Mr. Mahon the first day, and we went to Levelland for him to make a speech. And we got back, and the first question from Mrs. Mahon was, well, how did he do? Well, for a kid 22 years old, that never been outside of Lubbock, he did great.
He did great.
He did great. But they kept up with each other a lot. Then they had one daughter, Daphne. And she married a fellow named Duncan Holt, and they were really fine. And they had 3 children, but the apple of Mr. Mahon's eye was his grandson named George Mahon Holt. And Mr. Mahon was always emphasized the Mahon more than the Holt, but that's the way daddies do.
They do. Alan, we appreciate you taking time to share your story of working with Congressman Mahon, and we want to let our listeners know that we will have you back later this season to talk more specifically about your extensive work with Lubbock and the broader West Texas community.
I'd love to do that.
Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of Archive West Texas.